Want me to come over there?
Anybody can.
I know, I'm
Good
feeling a little
evening.
bit like an island right now.
My name's Nina Milligan. I'm the Vice Chair of the Transportation Advisory Board, and I'm calling this month's meeting to order on Monday, July 22nd at 6:04 p.m. We don't have a quorum yet, so the first item on the agenda for action is the approval of minutes. I'm going to hold them until later in the meeting. If we get enough people, we'll call for a motion to approve or to get comments on it, and if not, we'll table it to the next meeting. The next item on the agenda is public comments, and I'm going to invite anyone who'd like to speak now because it's on the agenda at this time, or if they would prefer, I'm also going to invite public comments after each topic on the agenda items. Is there anyone who would like to speak now in the public comment section? Connie Marsh, please do. And please introduce yourself and your relation to the city.
I'm Connie Marsh, and my relationship to the city, I suppose, is pain in the ass. But I live up on, you're the only one who laughs because you're the only one who knows me. So I looked at the agenda last meeting, and I looked at the agenda this meeting, and there's not enough for a community member to understand whether they should come, whether they want to come, or what their comments should be in advance. I see that you have something in paper, but that doesn't give a person any time to read it, understand it, ask questions, and then make good public comment. So I would ask, as is the standard in the city, that while the agendas are supposed to come out 5 days in advance of the meeting, so are the links to any information that is going to be on those agendas. And if it's of an urgent nature, then you can do it. But if it is just a matter of business, then it can be postponed to the next meeting, because the whole idea is for the community to be brought along with you all. So as I have been talking to future council members, it is fascinating because at least one of them says we can solve congestion, and that they think the solution to congestion is widening roads. So I don't feel, because you all are going on the multimodal pathway, that you actually understand that at least a third, maybe half of this community still thinks that you can widen roads and add auto capacity, and that will solve traffic congestion. So no matter what you say or do or plan, if you're going to ask for money for this, you're going to have a heck of a time getting the votes, because they think that you are solving it the wrong way. So I don't know how you're going to start this community conversation earlier so that you don't have to stop, backtrack, teach all of your community members what's going on, because I think that's where you're headed. I've said it over and over, so I'm so bored with hearing myself say it in a variety of venues, and Sheldon is looking confused. But Sheldon is actually only recently come on board with the idea that you can't solve congestion. The rest of the city has been working very diligently to widen roads and add turn lanes for many, many years. So I don't know if I can do that.
No, you can't.
Going out to your community gathering places and bringing the people along with you and saying what you're doing and absorbing the community feedback for what they're thinking, not just y'all, I think is imperative at this point in time. So I'm going to add like 3 exclamation points to that, but not repeat. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. You are welcome to stay and comment later as we go through the topic items, too. Anybody else who wishes to speak under the public comments section of the meeting? Seeing none, I will move on to our agenda items, number 4, of which there are 5 subheadings. I'm going to turn over the new chair nominations to Stephen Padua for an explanation and some help with us in a discussion item.
So for this item, Chair
Magali, AJ, is moving with his wife to the Midwest.
Ohio.
Where?
Ohio.
Ohio. So he has resigned his position as chair, which is why this is on the agenda. And so we are going to be opening this up to this agenda item for nominations for elections at the next meeting. And because we don't have it in our bylaws that the vice chair would take over, we still need to have election for the chair. And if Nina is elected as vice chair to become chair, then we then need to elect a vice chair. So that'll be the proceedings that we'll be taking on at the next meeting. And we'll be kind of opening it up to nominations now and then prior to the next meeting next month.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
So last time we did this, we had nominations at the meeting, and then in the interim, you also solicited statements of interest and shared them with the board so that then when we came to the next meeting, we were better prepared to vote. Is that going to be the same thing?
Yep, we can do it that way as well.
Does everybody remember that? Okay. Okay. So good?
Yep,
Okay, so
that's it.
then I think I can open up nominations for the position of chairman for the Transportation Advisory Board. Do I have any nominations? Yes, Em?
I nominate Nina for chair.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other nominations for chair?
I nominate the same person. I nominate Nina for chair.
Yeah, good. She's well nominated now. Okay, so we have a nomination for the chair. Is there anyone else that we might, that you would like to nominate? The nomination doesn't have to be accepted this evening, so if you nominated somebody who was not present, Stephen can pass on that nomination and ask for their acceptance. So just one more try, no? And the nominations for chair are closed. With that, because I am the vice chair, I will now open up nominations for vice chair. And again, it can be somebody who's here or somebody who's not here, because they can take this idea home, and Stephen will follow up with you and see if you would like to accept the nomination. Are there any nominations for vice chair? I'd like to nominate Cynthia for vice chair. Are there any other nominations for vice chair?
I mean, I was going to nominate Cynthia too, but I think you beat me to it.
Yeah, sorry about that, I didn't mean to.
Thank you.
Are there any other nominations for vice chair? None? So those are the nominations. Stephen will process these nominations, and then we'll come to the next meeting with a packet who these people are and why they should serve in this capacity, and then we will vote. Nominations are closed now, right? Okay, nominations are now closed. Everybody okay with that? Did I go too fast? Can we keep the nominations open? Excellent. Oh, good.
Wondering about
Okay.
that.
Nominations are still open. Nominations are still open. Stephen will help us in the meantime to collect the nominees for our consideration at the next meeting. That's more accurate, right? Okay. Welcome, Tom.
Hi.
We were just taking nominations for the chairman and the vice chair. The chairman's resignation was announced by Stephen because he's moved to the Midwest and had to resign his post. He moved today, as I recall. And I was nominated for chair, and that's the only nomination so far for chair. And Cynthia was nominated as vice chair, and that's the only nomination so far for vice chair. But the nominations are still open, so you can catch up by email or telephone with Stephen, and then we'll have a packet ready for the next meeting for voting.
Okay with both of
Good.
those?
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, moving on to the next agenda, item B, a special presentation from King County Public Health and the benefits of multimodal transportation. Stephen, would you introduce our guest, please?
Yes, this is Richard Gelb. I'll let him introduce his position with public health, but he's here to help talk about some of project selection criteria and performance metrics as we develop them.
Thanks, everyone. I'm Richard Gelb. I'm with Environmental Health.
Richard, I'm so sorry. I have to confine you to a microphone for our video audience.
Okay, I
That
will
doesn't
dutifully
too much.
return myself to the mic then.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, thanks. I'm Richard Gelb. I'm with Public Health Seattle King County in the Environmental Health Division, planner, trying to get out there and drive health considerations into the array of plans that are underway at the local, county-wide, regional level. So thank you all very much for including this topic in your meeting today. I'm going to just kind of help you understand kind of what's going on with health inequities around the area, and then speak to how transportation master plans and mobility plans can have a constructive bearing on those health outcomes. So I hope by the end of my 20 minutes with you, you will begin to see yourself as a health advocate, as having the opportunity to improve the conditions in the area that you serve so that health outcomes improve, and specifically those whose health outcomes are most challenged have the opportunity to improve, and therefore we can make progress on health inequities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about inequities, what that means, how transportation plans and the projects that are bundled up in a plan can have a bearing on those health inequities, and then just share some additional resources y'all might want to follow up on down the road. I do have handouts that I can leave behind that are kind of the standard King County infographics on inequities in the area. I'm going to kind of hone in on the health-related inequities so that you have a sense of how that's playing out. And starting off here with life expectancy at birth. So by race and place, and we tend to break down the information on community conditions by race and place, basically to make sure you start to get a sense of how those relate in King County. So how the distribution of conditions, life expectancy at birth in this case, are distributed, breaking those that variability down both by the racial composition of our residents, which is on the left side there, where life expectancy at birth is presented for each racial category, and then by place over here on the right side, where in this case it's broken down by the zip codes that have the longest life expectancy with the green dots, and the gray dots representing the zip codes where the life expectancy of residents today are the shortest. And then, and you can see that, you know, there's about 11 years difference in aggregating by race. And you can see that there's a little bit less when we bundle everyone up into these big zip codes. But my main point here is that when we zero in on specific neighborhoods, that difference gets much greater. And in fact, in King County, we have some of the most pronounced disparities in life expectancy at birth of any major metropolitan area. And when you zero in on the smaller neighborhood differences, the classic case that was just kind of surfaced in a recent UW study is basically the kind of North SeaTac, East Aquila community is a male born today will live more than 18 years less than a male born today in South Mercer Island. So what goes into that, it's all the things that lead to a full life being cut short based on exposure to motor vehicle accidents or violence, and medically related things, disease prevalence rates, morbidity associated with chronic disease like, you know, metabolic diseases, heart disease, stroke, et cetera. So that's just the predicament we're in. There's a lot of factors that go into this, everything from the condition of the built environment to economic factors associated with access to healthcare and conditions associated with occupational hazards. Metabolic disease also is pretty differing across our landscapes. So classic metabolic diseases, obesity, diabetes, and this is just one example of how that differs based on the race and places across our county. And those disease rates are shown by race on the left and by place, same kind of a thing, where the zip codes with the lowest percentages of this metabolic disease are in the green, and the zip codes with the highest percentages of this particular metabolic disease are in the gray dots, and it's about a 20% difference in that condition. Another disease that is affected by our built environment is asthma, and this is just a depiction of where asthma hospitalizations are, the homes where those hospitalizations are generated from. And you can see the general pattern where there is a trend here. If you look at where those conditions, where we have the most pronounced and elevated rates of asthma, kind of resembles where we have other conditions. You guys here in Issaquah don't have, obviously, a lot of the built environment conditions and economic conditions that would yield disparities that show up on a county-wide basis. But my point here in just kind of introducing the notion of health disparities is that as you zoom into a community of even, less than 100,000 or what have you, there is quite a bit of variation within a community like this, and opportunities y'all have to affect transportation master plan elements and the quality and characteristic of the built environment can have a bearing. This is kind of a summary, just kind of wrapping up and putting a exclamation point on health disparities. This is a image that links together multiple built environment affected hospitalization rates. So this is bundling together asthma, diabetes, and heart disease, and showing where the geographies from which residents come to healthcare facilities for treatment for those environmentally related diseases. Any questions on any of this stuff? Yes, Tom.
Yeah, on the map that's currently up there right now, underneath the legend where there's that large swath of blue that looks like it just starts just a little bit south and east of Lake Sammamish and then the rest of King County. I'm not sure if that is moderate by color or if that's the very low, or why that would be moderate if it is moderate for the rest of King County.
Yeah, sorry that's cut off and it doesn't show it very well. I'm assuming you're right that it is moderate, and that may be a function in part of the shape of that census tract, and it may be kind of grabbing some areas outside of Issaquah. So my apologies that I don't have Issaquah specific information on this, but something I could get and follow up and kind of allow you to see where your city stands.
Oh, I know where our city stands, right at the bottom of Lake Sammamish. So I'm okay with that. I was just curious why there was such a large group that was all kind of out in the country that's all moderate. And they would probably have just a minimal effect on this just because they're on the tail end, probably up to High Point.
Yeah, I agree that I'm agreeing with you that that it's probably the shape of the census tracts that are captured in that. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I'm just going to extend a little bit into this notion of how transportation plans bear on those whose needs are greatest. And this comes from the Puget Sound Regional Council's recent travel behavior survey. Just a couple of bar charts here that are showing folks' response to the question, how often do you go for a walk longer than 15 minutes? And the folks that are have a high percent of weekly walks are those whose household incomes are lowest. And so this is really moving us toward the rationale for why should you care about built environment conditions that you may have, that you may be steering resources toward in your plan. It's because the folks that are going to be using the non-vehicle, non-car transportation elements tend to be used more by your lower income residents. This chart here is taking the same information about walking frequency and showing that the very top bar are those households that have 4 or more cars, and you can see that the percent of those with high walking frequency is the lowest, and as you move to 3 cars, you have 15% of the folks going for a walk longer than 15 minutes a day, and as you move to 2 cars, you have 25%, and then 31, and folks who have 0 cars have the most walking trips. So this is just trying to share with you why focusing on those non-motorized elements are going to lift up the conditions for those whose needs are greatest. All right, this is a heck of a busy slide, and you don't really need to understand all of it, but it is here to let you know that we are not winning on a national level and on a state level. We don't have all this information at a local level. But I did look at the recent state report, and our numbers here in the state represent these national numbers. We are experiencing increased pedestrian deaths nationally, statewide, and this is a function of a lot of things. It is a function of the size of vehicles and, you know, a lot of other factors, but we are not heading in the right direction, and so transportation master plans that emphasize pedestrian safety are going to be your opportunity to bend the curve on this. Also nationally and locally, where VMT is going up, we do have on the national level a slight increase in walking trips, and vehicle occupant deaths are declining. And I just grabbed a little pull quote here. You know, older adults, people of color, people walking in low-income communities bear the highest share of the harm caused by vehicle collisions. So why is multimodal transportation good for health? Some of this is obvious, right? Those who are getting out and getting themselves from point A to point B in a non-vehicle supported way are going to have more physical activity. And physical inactivity currently is the 4th leading mortality risk factor. So the residents in your community who are physically inactive are facing higher risk of death and disease because of the lack of physical activity in their lives. Physical activity and auto dependency increase together. I've got a slide coming up that kind of shows the history of how this has evolved in our communities, but it's something that we have to recognize is a phenomena that has been building for generations, and you know, as your public testament shared, it's kind of on us to go from the vicious cycle of auto dependence and increased inactivity to the virtuous cycle of increased bike facilities and stimulating that way of getting around that leads to better health outcomes. There's also a lot of very high quality studies that have now completely validated that investment in bicycle and pedestrian facilities are good for everyone, including those operating vehicles. So death rates in all communities no matter whether you're looking by country, by state, by city, we'll just keep it on the city level. Cities that have invested in greater bicycle and ped facilities have lower death rates for all residents associated with transportation, even those only in cars. And obviously, air quality improves as vehicle use declines. Active transportation fosters community cohesion. Yes. Nina?
Anybody else have a question about this slide? Richard, thank you. It seems like it's a little more complicated too, though. However, as I look at the second bullet point, physical inactivity and auto dependency increase together with the asterisk saying adults living in sprawling counties have a higher body mass indices, blah, 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 more likely to be obese. However, your map, I don't believe showed that by zip code. I thought the higher obesity rates were in the city, and those sprawling suburban areas had green dots. So this is a simple way of looking at it, right?
Right. Yeah. What that other slide didn't correct for, that this analysis does, that I'm footnoting here, is the socioeconomic factors.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, so that's why we can say that this is true, even though in King County, not corrected for economic factors, we have higher obesity rates in areas, some of which are not sprawled in terms of the land use patterns. Good point.
Question also.
Any other questions, Cynthia?
I'm certainly the last bullet point about fostering community is it could be considered obvious, but I'm curious if there's data and what metrics, because I've seen this material before, but I hadn't seen anything that really, I mean, I've seen people talk about how it could be,
Yeah.
but I haven't seen any is there actual data and what metrics are they using?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of data on this, and it has to do with basically the human interactions that occur in buses and at bus stops and in bike lanes and at traffic, and where people can be physically see each other face to face, and it fosters a sense of community. And so where this comes from is those cities with higher bike ped and transit use, there are measures of social cohesion, and they come out higher in those communities. And the measure of social cohesion is typically done on a willingness to intervene on behalf of. And so they ask residents, for example, if you saw somebody spray painting your neighbor's garage, what would you do? Kind of questions, and they find that people will intervene and call and do stuff more readily where social cohesion is higher. Where social cohesion is lower, it's more, I'm just going to close the shutters and pretend I don't see it. So that's what's going on, is that the human interactions are fostering an increased sense of trust and an increased sense of willingness to do something to enhance the well-being of the
I mean,
community.
the logic behind it makes sense. I just hadn't ever seen any metrics around that.
Yeah, a real good place for metrics on this is the Victoria Transportation Policy Institute, and they've done some studies on this. And then another one on active transportation and happiness that I maybe mentioned on another slide is end-of-trip studies where major employers in this area also ask folks how they got to work, part of the Commute Trip Reduction Act that is going on in the state, and their level of satisfaction with their commute. And car drivers have the lowest level of satisfaction, and bicyclists and those who walk to work report being the happiest and enjoying their commute the most. And I think that may feed into cohesion, although that was a little bit of a different
Thanks.
angle. Yeah.
Any other questions right now? No? Okay, thanks, Richard.
Okay, so in terms of why you all want to increasingly be advocates for multimodal transportation and active transportation amenities in your communities, so that you can ensure your community is equitable and inclusive, especially serving those under 8 or over 80, and ensuring that a full range of users are able to take advantage of the transportation infrastructure investments that y'all will be lifting up as part of this planning process. Affordable, lower cost for system users, and there's a variety of ways of measuring each trip. And, you know, for every car trip, the amount of investment that has gone into that is pretty staggering when you look at the, you know, there's about 6 parking spots for every car in a typical city, and that's a lot of space and a lot of cost. So on a per trip basis, all of those non-motorized trips are going to be your lowest cost per trip. And so you're affording people mobility with a lower, you know, community investment in those trips. Healthier, both in terms of the physical activity, the community cohesion and trust. Safer, I mentioned that high bicycle mode share cities are safer for bicyclists and all road users. Greener, we got the air, GHG, noise, and then the kind of the amount of land required for some modes is very different than others. Resource efficient, and the economic development and tourism, as well as productivity benefits of those cities that are less car dependent. Sorry, this image isn't very good, but this is 60 people if they all had their cars, if they were all in one bus, or if they came by bicycle. And so, you know, vehicle-dependent transportation master plans gobble up a lot of space, and that space then is not available for other uses, be it green space, affordable housing, engaging retail, et cetera. So the ingredients, what should you all be prioritizing in your plan if you want to see a mode shift toward healthier options for your residents? Clearly, good biking and walking conditions, all these things that you would suspect. The transit service has a strong bearing. People obviously like to be able to use bicycle or walking to get to a transit stop to get to their ultimate destination. And I know that you guys don't have a huge amount of control over the transit piece of this, but you certainly have control over the things that make transit work well, like transit prioritization and lanes, prioritizing signalization and all those things. Good connectivity, so isolated transit service, bits and pieces of bike and ped stuff that doesn't connect in, doesn't lace together in a nice multimodal network is not as good, obviously. Infrastructure for car share, bike share, ride hail. This is obviously increasingly important, including safe pickup drop-off zones for ride hail is very important for pedestrian, bicycle safety, reducing the door zones, et cetera. Infrastructure like the, you know, I don't know what y'all are doing on scooters and bikes, but should they arrive, they probably need to have designated zones for being left. And increasingly, as the chatter before the meeting, you know, the geofencing technologies are really increasing, and the more progressive cities that are allowing these scooter bike rental programs are upping their game on the requirements for the geofencing, and you can even have bikes not returnable in a downtown area unless they're in a bike state corral area, is increasingly what's going on here to allow those modes to be feathered into the city environment without the potential problems with folks that are mobility impaired. Universal design, this is, you know, speaking to how frequently we, even able-bodied people, probably all use curb cuts and other amenities that are universal design. Convenient user information and the social marketing, these are the non-physical stuff that correlate to high non-motorized dependent communities. So the understanding how to use some of the other modes and then the promotion of those has been shown to be important and could be feathered into a transportation master plan. Okay, I mentioned earlier about how did we get here so that, you know, we face such a gobbling up of the landscape of our city for vehicle-dependent uses. You know, it all started back here when we did some planning that was auto-oriented, and then that led to some reduced travel options as those lanes expanded and squeezed out space that might have been used for other purposes, and there might have been some stigmatization of those who were using alternative modes, and we may have had, you know, chopping up of land and pushing up of single-family uses in remote areas that caused us to be car dependent. That planning, that parking supply, the diverse pattern led to the car ownership. All the car ownership led to the demand for auto-dependent rights of way, et cetera. So this is just kind of a little summary on the negative feedback loop that has led to the car-dependent cultures we mostly live in. And I just kind of took a quick swing at, okay, well, what is the virtuous cycle of healthy mobility? So expanding and improving conditions for bike riding and walking, frequent useful public transportation, densities and connectivity, supporting infrastructure, informed, incentivized residents. So I think that is what we hope to stimulate happening, is creating the alternate modes and then supporting folks and accessing them safely. And so, you know, seeing folks out in alternate modes is the prime way that others consider doing it. All right, I'm going to close up with a few planning principles and some additional resources y'all might want to pursue. Planning principles, these are things that are baked into the plan itself if you want to advance non-auto dependent mobility. Recognizing all travel demands. There are folks that got here on a bicycle, will be leaving another business in a wheelchair or a walker, and if we are considering all those travel demands in the context of this planning process, it will yield better outcomes for those most vulnerable and whose mobility needs are most acute. Counting every trip is important, because if you have a way of quantifying your what is produced by all the transportation infrastructure and services, and that way of counting what is produced in terms of trips is blind to those small trips that may be from this door to the 7-Eleven, then we will continue to leave out those granular trips that really are vital transportation for the residents that have chosen to go that way. So if we're only counting car trips, we will be blind to the degree that different interventions yield more active mobility and more active transportation. Disaggregating measurement is not just looking at mode split for the entire city and calling that a target, but recognizing that, you know, there's a lot of variability based on where folks are or what their circumstances are. And if we break down measurement, disaggregate, we'll be able to see how different approaches have varying ability to improve conditions. And this is the under 8 and over 80. This may be by income, might be by ability, it might be by land use type. Those in certain geographies might have expectations for mode splits that are different from those in other parts of the city itself. Reducing or eliminating parking space requirements, both on the business side and the residential side, is one of those ways that we get out of that vicious circle of overbuilding the limited space we have for vehicles, and managing transportation demand, which is a lot of kind of interventions that promote getting more out of whatever transportation we do, whatever infrastructure is invested in.
Can you pause for just a moment?
Yeah.
Are there any comments or questions? I just have one for our staff. We've brought up a few times that integrating transportation and land use planning, we have recognized as being an important thing, or at least I've said so, and I think I've heard it from other board members. And we're doing the master a mobility plan, and it's trying to separate those things, but it seems very difficult to do.
Yeah.
How does a transportation plan do land use planning?
Well, there's a variety of potential touch points, and I don't know if there is a land use committee like yours, but the possibility that y'all had a joint session and looked at those interfaces and came to understand how zoning and what's being required in the land use plan in terms of everything from, required parking, EV charging, ride-hail, drop-off, pickup points, end-of-ride facilities. Do major employers, are they required to have a locker room for those arriving by bicycle? That's a land use building consideration that has a direct bearing on the degree people are going to ride their bicycles to that employment center. So those are your opportunities to say, from a transportation side, these are the land use characteristics that would optimize our goal of active transportation, and they may have some requests back to the transportation plan that might foster the kind of land uses that they're seeking in terms of densities and lower, fewer car-dependent families in certain areas, and then that may be a signal to y'all to be thinking about prioritizing for the infrastructure to get to those communities that are anticipated to be more affordable, lower car ownership households.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to close here. I don't know if your transportation plan is going to have targets for things like mode share, but it gets back to a point I made earlier about hopefully those mode share targets will not be an aggregated target, but they will be disaggregated, and you will consider what's realistic in different land use types or in different geographies within the city of Issaquah. So, your mode share, the optimal mode share is going to depend on the density, the conditions, your policy intent, but your more affluent suburban areas, you're going to have higher automobile mode share, and as you move from those geographies that are more suburban and move into sorry about that. As you move into denser areas, you would expect, and I would assume would be seeking to have a higher percent of the trips achieved out not using a car. Does that make sense? Or any questions about target setting? All right, I'll leave you with some resources that speak to least cost integrative planning. This gets to the notion of showing how those non-motorized vehicle trips can be fostered with a fraction of the investment of those investments in car-based travel. Fairness and inclusivity, multimodalism and GHG emissions, in case you're trying to reconcile to a climate plan and you want to kind of calibrate your mode shift and your vehicle utilization levels to what is realistic within your climate targets. Mode diversity and public health, and health impact assessment resources are here for you. Yes, Tom?
Is there a way that we'll be able to get a copy of these resources to look at them?
Yeah, Stephen will send that around.
Following up on that, Stephen, this wasn't in our packet, so I know that you can get these slide deck to us, but how does the public get an opportunity to have access to this too?
The presentation will get included with the minutes with this meeting.
Okay, thank you. That'd be excellent.
And we don't have time for it now, but just so you know, I did capture some of the most progressive mode share targets from other cities, so you have a sense of what is, what ambitions other geographies have. There are some basic steps to looking deeper at mobility, health equity, and I'll leave it at that.
Great. No more questions? Thank you so much, Richard. Really appreciate you coming in tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And thank you, Stephen, for making this information available to us and the public.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else to say on this, or are you ready to introduce the next section?
I'll go ahead and introduce the next section. I'm going to combine the next two agenda items just into one.
Great, so the next two are the Mobility Master Plan Schedule Update and the Mobility Master Plan Next Phase Outreach, both done by you, Stephen.
Yes.
Padua. So why don't you
Just
go
as
ahead.
a quick reminder, the Mobility Master Plan is going to be our long-range planning document. It's going to define new policy for transportation and eventually replace the transportation element in our comprehensive plan as we look at a more multimodal transportation system. As you've seen before, we've gone to develop guiding principles that'll help guide the development of this master plan as we go through each section, from the performance metrics to project selection criteria to even the type of projects that we start to, or project lists that we start to develop through this process, is going to be following these principles. And where we are today in terms of like the project schedule, we're just about in the middle. We're in that next phase where we are starting to identify the policies, programs, and projects, and Sarah is going to talk a little bit about kind of how we're starting that process with the modal networks. And for the board, this is kind of going to be your schedule each month through the summer and fall of going through each of these topics as we kind of move into the draft planning process later this year. This is all information that I'm just kind of reiterating from the previous meeting. What is new is that for the next phase of engagement, what we're going to do is we're going to actually go to each of the boards and commissions with the same information that you're going to be presented with tonight, and get their perspective on how the modal networks overlap with the work that they do, but also on how transportation can benefit a lot of the work that they're working on, from the scope of what human services looks at, or from the policy planning and even the business perspective of how transportation is connecting customers as well as getting freight goods to a lot of the businesses. And then for a lot of the other community groups that we previously spoke with and had conversations with, we're going to develop a meeting in the box, which is basically a method of facilitation where we give them a package of materials where each of the individual groups will be able to ask very similar questions and have similar conversations that we're going to be having, but we'll be able to do it a lot more broad without having to require as much staff resources. And that is your update. Are there any questions? A lot of it is reiteration of what we discussed before, so I just want to make sure
That was
it's...
a combination of C and D.
Yes.
I have a question about what's the time frame for when we go to those other commissions?
It'll be August and September, going to their board and commission meetings.
And then based on that bar chart of the schedule, that means the feedback we get, that feedback will help us in our draft planning and draft review.
Yeah. Any other questions?
And if there aren't any other questions, I forgot to ask if there's any public comment about each of these two sections, the King County presentation and public health in this. Are there any public comments about the things that we've covered so far? I see an audience member. one, please come to the lectern. And we're just now getting additional public comments on the
Right.
things that we've discussed so far.
So Connie Marsh again, and I do live up on Squawk Mountain. So you all's role is specifically not to interface with land use and particular projects. You all are supposed to be the sort of the policy carriers. But that still leaves this gap for when you take private development and public projects through sort of an unknown process, there is nothing. It's a void. So some of the streets, they go out to these big public meetings, but there's no sort of guiding committee. When you take a private development through Development Commission, they say the transportation is out of your purview, and that is up to the engineers in town. And so the community and the commission does not get to comment on how they would interface with those intersection changes or the transportation that is happening with that development. And to me, this is a big black hole that you all are not filling because they created you specifically exempting that from what you can do. So I don't know how you get that in the conversation except for to attempt to create policies that would make something to fill in that tissue. So I think it's super important. Look at Newport Way and our issues with private and public development all along a corridor that's just been a mess. So thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Is there anybody else who wishes to speak about these first topic items, A, B, C, or D? No? Stephen, I think we can move on to letter E, the Mobility Master Plan, Modal Networks and Guidelines. If you would introduce our guest presenter, that would be great.
Yes, this is Sarah Peters. She is the project manager with our consultant, Fair & Peers. We work very closely together on each of these steps and all the items that you've been receiving on the Mobility Master Plan. And tonight, she's going to start talking about the draft modal networks and guidelines, which is that starting point to developing policies, programs, and projects. And I'll let her come introduce herself as well.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you to the board. Tonight, I'm going to be talking specifically about how we fill the gaps in the networks. The Mobility Master Plan is building on quite a number of plans that the city has already developed. But when we put all those together, we need to understand from the community's point of view, and that's why you're here tonight, how do we prioritize finding projects that fill in the spaces that haven't already been identified in your existing plans. So Stephen already introduced me. I'm with Fair & Peers. And this is just a quick overview of the plan process. So currently there are two parallel processes working together. You'll see the 4 arrows on the left of the screen. In green, assessing the planning context and future needs. We've submitted a planning context report and a draft future needs report to the city for review, for staff to review. And then coming out of that, we'll be developing a project list, building on your adopted plans, and also the network gaps. And we'll be discussing those network gaps tonight. In the meantime, and this is something that you've had quite a bit of input on, we've also been developing guiding principles for the Mobility Master Plan. That's something that the Transportation Advisory Board and City Council have had input on. It's also been vetted in the first phase of public engagement for this plan. And next, and you've already had some input on this, they're being revised right now to reflect that input, developing project evaluation criteria and performance metrics. So once all these projects come together, how do you prioritize between them and get the ones that are most important to the top of the list and the other ones towards the bottom of the list. And the reason why that's so critical, of course, is that funding is limited, and we know that there are going to be more projects than the city can ever afford to build, so we need to know what are the most important projects. And then combining those two, the projects list and the project evaluation criteria, there will be a prioritized project list. And then with those performance metrics, after the plan is implemented, the community can continue to evaluate how well it's being implemented and whether it's achieving its goals. So this is where we are right now. And tonight, we'll be talking specifically about how we should approach filling in gaps in your project list. So we'll dive into this. There's a memorandum that you've all received. It's very short, and I'll be walking you through all of it. But we'll talk about draft modal guidelines and modal networks. So the modal networks, and there are maps in the packet and also in this PowerPoint that show our approach to those networks. That looks at where to invest. The modal guidelines say how to invest. So what are the standards that we're trying to achieve just as we define these projects, right? So that helps me say, okay, I know where the city needs a sidewalk, but then what's the standard? Does it need to be, what is that standard, or what does that sidewalk need to look like? And the sources for these, we're building off of plans that the city has already adopted, and also the guiding principles that were defined for the mobility master plan. So as we work through these, what I would really like to hear from you, in addition to any other comments you have, are what is missing from the proposed guidelines and networks, and then is there anything that isn't needed, that's included but isn't really important?
Can I interrupt for a moment?
Of course.
Sarah, sorry. We just got this evening, right? And how many of you have had a chance to read it? Should we take a moment to read this? Are you expecting some productive, or is this going to come back to us later because none of us have had a chance?
She's actually going to walk through all of it right now. These are just primarily the questions she wants you to consider as she's walking through it.
Okay.
Right.
So then on the draft modal guidelines, you will talk us through what's on that page.
We are going to walk through all of that.
You
But
guys
thank
okay
you
with
for
that?
your question.
Thanks for that.
And I do want to reiterate, this is just the beginning of the process. So you'll have the opportunity, along with all of the boards and commissions that Stephen walked through, mentioned just now, to weigh in on the modal guidelines and networks for identifying the gaps in the projects. And then when we have a final project list or a draft project list, you'll have an opportunity to weigh in on that later in the process. So tonight, really what we want to get is a sense of, are we on the right track? Are we looking at the right things? Or are we leaving things out? Or on the other hand, is there maybe too much on the list that it doesn't make sense to include? And feel free, as you're looking through, to mark up the maps. We can collect your notes at the end of the evening, and to stop me and make any comments that come to mind. So the first focus area is walking. So there's really three ways that we're looking at the walking networks: sidewalks, crosswalks, and connectivity. And these are building on the pedestrian facilities from the Issaquah Comprehensive Plan, the Walk and Roll Action Strategy, and the guiding principles. So first, looking at sidewalks, we took a look at the sidewalk gaps in the city, and thinking about where sidewalks are needed. As you know, there are a number of gaps in the sidewalks in the city, and in some places that may be okay. Taking as our guidelines, first, that arterials and collectors, so your major streets with a lot of traffic, should have sidewalks on both sides of the street. Where there are sidewalks on no sides of the street or just one, you see that in red on the map. Local streets where speed limits are over 25 miles per hour. These draft guidelines are saying there should be sidewalks on at least one side of the street, so that where people don't have to walk in the same lane as higher speed traffic. That's shown in yellow on the map. So our questions again are, is this the right standard to have? Should every sidewalk, or should every local street have sidewalks on both sides or on one side of the street? Or should it just be in places with higher speeds? Should arterials and collectors all have sidewalks on both sides of the street, or are there places where it's not necessary?
Are you opening that up for our discussion?
I am absolutely opening that up for your discussion.
Does anybody want me to try a thing here? Can I ask a question about this?
Of course.
Give you guys a second to think about it. This is making an assumption, or it seems like it's making an assumption that walking is only done on sidewalks. And I'm thinking about some of the multi-use paths, say in Bellevue, that aren't sidewalks, but they allow for multiple use.
Right.
How does that play into this?
So that plays into this, not so much in this area, but later, and we didn't necessarily create a map for it, but in terms of connectivity, we're looking at sidewalks and trails as a single connected network, with the understanding that if you're looking at a major destination, trails shouldn't be the only way to get there, because sometimes it's late at night, or people are using a mobility device and it's not convenient or safe for them to use a trail. But that said, we are looking at connectivity, including Issaquah's Green Necklace, as one of the factors to include in the networks.
And then I have another question about the map. Where you have these red squiggly lines, say, let's look at Squawk Mountain for an example. That's talking about an arterial missing. It's hard to tell what's the rest of the arterial there, because it's not marked. It's just the part that doesn't have the sidewalk is not. Just the part that does not have the sidewalk is marked. So you would assume that 12th going up from Tibbetts has sidewalk on both sides until you get to that point where you do the red squiggly. They get you up to the top of the hill. See what I mean?
I do.
And then where do I go from there? You know, I'm going down by the cemetery, I think, but it's really kind of hard to read that part of the map.
Okay. So,
And that part has sidewalks on both sides.
correct. So would it be helpful if we brought out those streets more in the map so it's easier to read?
Well, I don't know, maybe if an overlay of what are the arterials, and then among the arterials, which are the ones that have, where are the missing gaps?
Yeah, I think what's missing from this is what do they tie into? Because I know up on top of Bach where they have been doing some sidewalks up along there, and the other one down towards the bottom, I know that's Wildwood, and I know that road quite well because it's where I live on. That it goes up to a certain point, and then there's no sidewalks that go up. So I know that's continuing, but when it gets up to the top of the hill, which is to the left side of that bottommost line that has the V-drop, I don't know what it ties into up there. So it'd be nice if this had some sort of, I don't know if you have it, but if this could show where it ties into an existing sidewalk so you can see the whole connectivity part of it.
Right. So I think one thing that we can definitely change the way that the map is displayed to make that clearer, so that it's easier to get some context there.
What's the objective of this map then for us today, besides discussing the criteria?
So what this map is showing is where projects would be included in your mobility master plan. So if we move forward with this approach to saying, here's where gaps are, all of these would be included in your mobility master plan as a place where sidewalks need to be added.
If these are the criteria.
Yeah, if these are the criteria.
So I have a quick question about the data, because like looking at Newport Way,
Right.
theoretically, since it's not colored either yellow or red, it would assume being an arterial that it has sidewalks. But Newport Way does not have sidewalks.
It has actually the path sidewalk on both sides. You have the nice drainage ditch that they won't pave over and put into pipe. But they have basically the road, the ditch, and then there's basically a sidewalk on both sides all the way down to almost to where the elementary school, and then there's one that just continues on the north side that goes all the way to that's King County Library and to the whole Target shopping area.
But it's not both sides.
It's kind of a paved asphalt path on the side. It's not like what you would think is a perfectly smooth concrete sidewalk. It's kind of more of a path sidewalk on the side of the road.
I'm just thinking about like with my neighborhood where the zoo is, then, I mean, I know there's a ton of development coming in, so theoretically those developers at some point will all make it nice frontage and then it will be there. I think, but I think I have to pay, clearly I need to pay more attention to the sidewalks on that area.
I think you've
And I guess that's
pointed
another
out.
question is the definition of like, how do we define sidewalk and how wide is our sidewalks? And do we care how wide they are? Is it just as long as there's separation of grade, or, you know, is there a certain width where there's passing comfortable? I mean, like, I'm not,
Correct.
I'd be curious to know what the definition of sidewalk is.
Yeah, and I'd like to come back to your point, like looking at Newport, I know there's going to be planned street changes there. So what I can't tell by this is it going to be assumed that that's going to have sidewalks on both sides when it's done? Or this just shows missing gaps of existing? So I'm a little bit, as far as, this shows the whole network of sidewalks within the city, I think.
This shows gaps in the existing network. And I think Stephen can speak more to the complete streets guidelines that are, and policy that are being developed. But that can be used to address the specific standards that are used for these sidewalks.
Oh, okay, okay.
I think that's an important thing for us to know, though, is that it's important to define the standards as these projects are defined. Stephen, I don't know if you want to add.
For the definition of sidewalks, it is typically just a grade-separated walkway.
Grade-separated walkway,
yeah.
okay. So an extruded curb would count. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Then yes, Newport Way has sidewalks on both
Yeah.
sides because there's that extruded curb. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, are there any additional comments on?
Maybe I
Yes,
just continue on. We'll see
All
where
right.
we go.
So then looking at crosswalks. Again, this is not the location of all the crosswalks we would be proposing, but these are areas, this is helping us to define where we would want to look for crosswalks to include in the mobility master plan. So what you see here, and it's a little bit easier to see in your packet than in on the screen here. We've identified key destinations. So these are schools, parks, community facilities. There are also community destinations defined in your walk and roll action strategy in 2015, so that does include employers and shopping centers, as well as police, hospitals, and fire stations. Those are shown as gray dots with a gray ring around them, so that's 600-foot ring. Also, pedestrian collisions are shown here in red and red dots, and bicyclist collisions are shown here in yellow diamonds. These are the areas we would focus on to identify crossing improvements. And so those crossing improvements would be just like that, could be just like that enhanced crossing, just in the neighborhood where there's a pedestrian beacon, high visibility crosswalk, and some pedestrian crossing signs. In some cases, you may not need all of that infrastructure, but you'd want to put high visibility striping, maybe a sign. So these, and that, the standards for those are going to be defined in the ongoing pedestrian crossing guidelines project that you have and you've heard about here. So our focus area is really, where has there been collisions that involve pedestrians? Where have there been collisions that involve bicyclists? And then where are people trying to go? To a school, to a shopping center, to City Hall, or to another community destination. And so our question for you again is, are we on the right track by thinking about where the community's already said this is a place we'd like to go and where we've seen collisions? Or are there other things we should think about as we look for places to add crosswalks to the system?
I don't see really the correlation between a bicycle collision and a crosswalk.
In some cases, that's a good question. So in some cases, in actually many cases, bicyclists use pedestrian facilities to cross. So when I'm riding my bicycle through an intersection, I will use the pedestrian signal to know if I can actually get through safely. A lot of bicyclists will do that. In a lot of other cases, you'll see collisions at a location where a bicyclist might be trying to cross the street. Now, we haven't done a deep dive into all of these collisions to see what was the bicyclist or the pedestrian trying to cross the street, or was there something else going on. But in a number of cases, people will be trying to get across the street at a location where, whether they're on a bicycle or whether they're walking, it's often the same location. But if you think it's not important, we can cut that out and just look at the pedestrian collisions.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question about reading the map.
Yes.
As I'm looking at it, I can recognize, it seems, places where there were collisions, so you're kind of pointing my attention there, but I already know that there's an enhanced crosswalk there.
Right.
So this isn't like the other, a suggested project list.
Yes, this is just where we're looking to add crosswalks where they may not already exist or have not already been identified in your plans.
So this doesn't show us the ones that are yet to be identified, because many of these have already been identified and enhanced.
Right. Our question is really, are we looking in the right places?
Are you looking in the right places? Because you're using the 600 feet. Is 600 feet a common distance for other mobility plans? The 600 feet from destination, how do we come to that number?
It's a number that we've used in other mobility plans. It's within a few minutes of walking time. So what we try to do is not put, and it's also a little bit longer than the minimum distance that you would recommend for intersections. Mm-hmm. So basically, we want to make sure that people are not going too far out of their way. So, a quarter mile out of their way to cross the street, especially. Oh, go ahead.
They won't do that.
They won't do that, right? And that's one of the reasons why we see pedestrian collisions, for example, at a bus stop across the street from a destination, right? So people won't go out of their way.
Right.
Stephen?
Yeah, one thing to add is when communities put these master plans together and the community says we want convenient access, typically 600 feet is actually that level of distance where it's actually a convenient distance.
Okay. And then another comment or observation I have, I don't really have any solid thought about it, but it sounds like enhanced crosswalk, which is not in quotes or capitalized or anything, is quite a wide range of options.
That's
and
correct.
So my thought was, is that defined enough to help provide direction?
Yes.
I don't know. What you got, Stephen?
There are national standards. Our current crossing guidelines do not define it well, which is why it's getting updated right now.
Okay. Well, who updates that?
We do.
We do. Oh, very good.
And just to add to Stephen's comment, those national standards are based on research by the Federal Highway Administration. The specific intervention that you might use is based on research on whether drivers stop, given the speeds and the width and how fast, how easily they can see. So.
Okay, cool. Are there any other questions or observations? Okay, go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you. So next, and this touches on your question about trails. So just to note that improvements to the sidewalk and trail network should prioritize connections to residential and employment centers, major destinations, and the Regional Growth Center in central Issaquah. This is really we'll be just taking a look at the trail systems. The city recently updated its park strategic plan, so there's a very complete and well-defined trails network, but we want to make sure that we're capturing that in this plan, so we're calling it out here. Moving on to bicycling. So, I'm sorry.
All right, yeah. I was just curious why you didn't include the green necklace in there, in the connectivity part, because it seems like the perfect spot to include it.
Okay.
I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, we will make sure to call out the green necklace specifically as we revise this moving forward.
Good idea, Kobe, thank you.
It's considered in the connectivity criteria, just wasn't spelled out here.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so moving on to bicycling. So we're looking at the bicycling priority network that was developed in the Walk and Roll Action Strategy and then incorporated into this Issaquah comprehensive plan. And we're looking at bicycle facility standards, thinking about them in relationship to who's riding and who's willing to ride. So you may be familiar with the concept of level of traffic stress. It's basically a rating scale for bicycle facilities. Level of traffic stress 1 is good, it's low stress. It's limited exposure to traffic, so very low traffic speeds, very low traffic volumes, often a trail. These are streets and trails and paths where children might feel comfortable riding, where I would feel comfortable taking my mom, who rarely bikes. I'd feel comfortable taking her on that. As you go up the level of traffic stress ladder, level of traffic stress 2 is interested but concerned. Adults are willing to ride it. It's There's some traffic exposure, but not a whole lot. Think a comfortable neighborhood street, maybe one slightly hairy intersection, but not bad. Level of traffic stress 3 is a typical adult bicycle commuter. As you know, not that many people ride their bikes to work, so that's not a whole lot of the population who's willing to ride under these conditions, but this is actually typical of many bike lanes that you see in Issaquah and around the region. Level of traffic stress 4, Stephen said I could say this, spandex warrior. So you know those people who will bike anywhere, in any condition. They're very brave. They're much braver than I am. I'm a bike commuter. They're braver than me. But there aren't very many of them. And so if you're trying to build a system that is actually useful for your whole population, you can't design it for the people who are comfortable in any condition, right? You have to design it for the folks at the other end of the spectrum. So with those concepts in mind, we took a look at the network that was identified in the walk and roll action strategy. And so that's what you see in yellow lines in the background. That's what's called out on the map. And then on top of that, we looked at the existing level of traffic stress. So based on that, we figured level of traffic stress 1 or 2 is pretty good, right? Most people are going to be willing to ride it. Level of traffic stress 3 and 4, which you see here in orange and red, those need to be improved. So many of the projects that are going to be pulled into this were already identified in the walk and roll action strategy. But we want to make sure that we are making recommendations that will bring those projects to a lower level of traffic stress, and also identifying any parts that might be missing. So as you look at this network, do you see any gaps? Do you see any connections that need to be made?
I have a question real
Yes,
quick,
please.
just to clarify what data I'm looking at. So this figure 2 shows what the current condition of the bike lanes are, and then the idea would be that the recommendation would be that we take the areas that are level 3 or 4 and we improve those up to a level 1 or 2?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. And so some of those projects are identified in the walk and roll action strategy. Many others may not be, or may not be at a level of traffic stress that would actually be comfortable for most riders.
I would like to comment that I'd really like to spend some time with this because this is an important part of my life.
Yes.
And I know all these roads and routes. I wouldn't be able to give you a really solid work right now as I'm looking at this, but another question arises in my mind, and that say we're looking at let's look at Gilman. Okay, when we're talking about Gilman and improving its LTS score, in this tool, would we be identifying how we would be improving it by perhaps taking the bike facility off the road, or extending the bike lane, or what are we saying about I want to lower the traffic stress?
Right. So there are a lot of ways to lower traffic stress, and as part of the project definition, that's what we'll be doing. So where the project hasn't been specifically defined by previous plans, or where there's a gap in those previous plans, but you say this is an important place to put a bikeway, we'd be defining it and saying, okay, based on what we know right now, you could improve your bike lane that's already there, maybe add some vertical separation, right? So people are actually farther away, and improve some intersection treatments, and that could get you to a better level of traffic stress. Or maybe there needs to be a little bit more planning so that you can see, can we actually physically separate the facility on Gilman to make it comfortable for more people to ride.
And then I'm sorry, just one more clarifying question.
Of course.
Maybe I just didn't hear you say it.
Sure.
How did these LTS scores, where did they come from? How did you find them?
Right, so we conducted an analysis using mapping software of all of the streets in the city to evaluate the level of traffic stress on all of the streets in the city. And Ideally, you could perhaps prepare, you could ideally, in an ideal world, you could reduce level of traffic stress on all of those streets, but that's not realistic given the fact that people need to drive places and you have a need for high capacity streets. And so we took that analysis and layered it on top of the corridors that were identified as important in the previous plans that have been adopted.
So is the traffic stress an impression that the bicyclist is having or that anybody using that corridor is having?
So the actual score that's, the score is based on the bicyclist exposure to traffic, and it's a combination of their physical separation from traffic and the speeds of traffic and the number of lanes on the roadway. So kind of taking those all together is a way of assessing how comfortable a bicyclist is likely to feel.
So it's all a mathematical formula based on the street
Yes.
and the volume.
Exactly.
It's based on topography, speed, volume, the built environment around it. It takes into a lot of different variables that it contributes to
Yeah, great
a
separation.
bicyclist stress level on a street.
Yeah.
So would part of this be, part of our goal is to recommend where there should be bike lanes, sharrows, cycle tracks, things like that then?
So we'll be coming back to you with a project list, and that'll be more specific about the types of facilities that would be recommended. But tonight, we really want to get your sense of, are we looking at the right things to identify those projects or not?
Oh, like basically the big, sorry, not order, but basically the big categories. So here where there are accidents. So is this where we should do crosswalks? Here's what, a bike network could look like based on other planning processes
Yes.
the city's done. Is this correct? One of the other things I'm wondering about, just sorry to jump ahead, is there
course.
going to be, I know we don't do zoning, but as far as like where density, potential new transit facilities are, that's going to be one of the pieces that determines sort of prioritization of list, I would assume, is like, maybe where there's the potential for a lot more bodies to be moving in. Is that where we try to create, mobility options first, so that culture is sort of set as as the communities are developing, or I don't know.
Yes, so the context of the built environment, I think is what you're getting to, will be incorporated as part of the prioritization of where we decide on projects, but also into the facility types as well.
Okay, thank you.
So, I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment. This looks at most of the arterials where existing bikes ride now, but there are also, for example, when I ride, I know all the back roads and back streets. So if you go down the backside of the library parking garage, continue straight, and you go through the city maintenance area, and then you cut over into another parking lot for another building, and then you cut into Near Avenue to try and avoid traffic. Is this looking at using all these different alternate routes? Not necessarily on an arterial, but that could be developed. Those could be developed more for bike to keep them away from the main roads for getting from one place to another place.
Right. So it sounds like one thing that would be useful for people biking in this town would be to have a well-defined network of neighborhood streets that they can use to get around. Did I understand that correctly? Or you clearly know all those streets, so you don't need it defined, but maybe that's something that other people would want to have defined for them.
Yeah, I think, if that would be the plan, that'd be signed, or there'd be a bike path or a bike route so that people would know about it, and they could use those other ways to keep off the main roads.
That's not shown on the map. I think it's a great idea for a project definition. Stephen?
Yeah, that's actually a policy question for the tab of should we be showing that network as part of this as well? Because that would be, City of Seattle does Seattle Greenways for local neighborhood streets that actually qualify as level of stress 1 in most cases. That would be shown on this network as family-friendly network connections through the neighborhoods, but also to all the major destinations. Is that what we want to consider for this network as well?
I think that would be really valuable.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. So based on that feedback, we'll take a look at this map and revise it to include level of traffic stress 1 facilities that are already there, that are your local streets. And one thing that could be really useful by doing that is actually to identify where there's a gap between those two. So often, and this is something we've definitely seen in Issaquah, you have a very comfortable local streets, and then in one neighborhood, and getting across an arterial to the other neighborhood where it's comfortable to ride your bike is very difficult and uncomfortable. Okay, thank you.
I'd like to follow up on that. Tom, thank you for bringing that up. As a example, in the East Sunset area, there, if I recall correctly, there's a bike route that's off Sunset, and you go through the neighborhood streets, but nobody wants to do that because they want to get where they're going,
right,
myself included. And so to identify the fact that this criteria identifies East Sunset Way as a place that needs to reduce its traffic stress,
right,
seems correct to me. Yeah, that's one of them. You know, like I said, it would be hard for me to evaluate this completely, but because that was on target, seems like you're in the going in the right direction. One thing that's confusing me, so anyway, to that point, people do want to travel directly in the shortest route when they're on a bike, especially if they're commuters and they're using it for transportation rather than just for recreation.
True.
Oh, then just to comment back, when you're looking at the map and you have the low-stress route going up to Issaquah Highlands from East Sunset, the line that is identified there is Highlands Drive, which is by no means a low-stress route on a bike. But if you take the trail, which is not on the road, this map doesn't distinguish that you'd be on the trail, which is a different, little different path. And maybe too high a level of detail, but kind of confused me.
No, thank you for calling that out, because that is showing the trail segment there, and so I think we can distinguish between those two to make it clearer that that is a trail, especially because there are some cases where people may not want to use the trail on a bicycle. Maybe it's late at night and they don't feel comfortable on a trail. Yeah.
And then you got just a big dang gap there because you can't ride on that road. And if you don't want to take the trail at night, then you just can't get to the Highlands that way.
Is there actually a connection on that, going up to the Highlands on that far
right?
green one?
I walked up that hill just day before yesterday, and it's a heck of a push on a bike through a forest. This is just a forest trail.
That's what I thought. It's
just a forest trail on the right-hand side.
Right.
Yeah.
Mountain biking.
Mountain biking would do it.
You're talking about Grand Ridge?
Low traffic stress, though, I'll tell you out there.
Apparently.
Yeah, through Grand Ridge. Does anybody else have anything else to contribute now?
I have a couple
Go ahead,
things.
Cynthia.
I have to admit, I am a little confused, and it could just be me, but so some kind of little things and big things. So I'm not entirely sure all the factors that go into how these scores come out. I know you touched on some of them, but I'd be really interested. And so, for example, like Front Street, like I don't know if you've ever ridden a bike on Front Street, but Front Street's a terrible place to ride a bike. And so, but there is a trail along the side, and I ride it several times a week. So that just makes me wonder, like, what I'm actually looking at.
Where's the low stress? Is it the trail?
Well, no, but two things. One is the trail's not there, so that confuses me. And then the fact that Front Street's rated as green is also super confusing. It's a terrible place to ride a bike. So I'm just a little confused as like the algorithms that go in here. And then the other question I have is a little more of a bigger question, and I don't think we're here yet. I guess I'm a little confused about exactly what kind of feedback we're supposed to be giving right now. But the thing that I'm kind of wondering is, are we going to be, when do we talk about what the strategy is? Are we going to take, some of these things are just not great places to ride a bicycle, and they probably never will be. And so how do we, everything just because it's red doesn't mean it needs to be brought up to green. So how do we decide that? I guess I'm just a little confused about that, like the idea of, and then one particular factor that I think would sway whether I think we should be investing more heavily is topography.
Right.
So topography and then land use projections, of course. So that would lead you to, like, you might conclude it's really important to make sure Gilman is a much better place to ride a bike, because there's obviously a developing population center. So I guess I'm not quite sure where we are in the process in terms of like the feedback
Yeah,
that's.
because if you go back to the other one where you define the stress, I think I'm coming to, so when my kids were younger, I would never, we would only ride on bike paths. We'd never ride on the street because it's just too dangerous for them. So I think having a stress level of trying to bring it up to a place where I'd ride a kid, I don't think I'd ride with my kids on any of these streets. But I commute a lot, and I ride for fun, and I like to be where there's no other cars or traffic, and I don't feel like I'm going to be hitting a car door opening or have a conflict. I look at all the back roads as I can as a commuter into Bellevue. And so if I look at this as far as, I think I'm really confused as far as, are we improving what we need to improve for those that are really going to be riding on the road? And it's probably going to be more of the commuter people that are going to be riding on the roads.
Right.
So I think, I'm not sure exactly where I'm going with that, but I'm trying to think of people going from Issaquah, from point A to point B, and what roads would they be taking? And those are the roads should be primarily improved or noted as a bike path, a bike route, to keep them off main roads, as opposed to just thinking about stress level as far as what are the roads that are really going to be used for a commuter, which are straight connecting or distance from one point to another, or it could be a little bit longer, but if they're off the beaten track of traffic, they'll probably be used more for a bike is actually going someplace.
Okay. So I heard
Does that
two.
make sense?
It does make sense. Thank you. And so I heard two questions from Cynthia and Tom. The first was what level of input is being asked for, and this is the level of input that's being asked for. Are we looking at the right places by identifying these direct routes that have already been called out in the walk and roll action strategy, or are there other things that we should be looking at? For example, these neighborhood streets where more people are likely to feel comfortable biking. And then there's a second question, which is very directly, do we look at these arterials and main streets and collectors, or do we look at neighborhood streets as the place to invest to make biking more attractive to more people? And that's a question for you, which is, what do you think are your priorities, and what do you think the community would respond to? And I've heard both of those sides argue that it should be more direct and that there should also be a neighborhood streets network that's quieter.
Let me ask a process question of Stephen. In the past, and I'm sorry to spring this on you because I'm not quite sure where this is going, but I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time to talk about the other things too. And you said in the past that some things might spin off into some subgroups to work on things in a finer detail, and I know that several of us have identified ourselves as bicyclists, and this is a priority. Is this one of those things you're looking for, or what? How could we complete this conversation when we have time to think about it and be better prepared?
It's exactly that. If there is a topic or a subject matter that you think that you need more time and more time to process, then that's a great example of a subcommittee to form and discuss that and make a recommendation to the full board.
Yeah, Cynthia, do you have anything else right now?
I don't know if this is outside the scope of this, but bike commuters are pretty willing to show up to a meeting to get their opinion. There's a lot of bike shops in town. There's a lot of cycling groups in town. I don't know if it's appropriated within the scope, but it just seems like it would be really easy to pull together 60 to 80 people to come in and draw on maps about where they ride and that sort of thing, if that work hasn't already been done. But honestly, maybe some of the questions that I have are just because I don't have the walk and roll plan. I mean, I've looked at it, but I certainly don't have the ideas. So maybe a lot of that work's already been done, but this just seems like we all want more engagement out of the community, and I feel like that's an easy sell to get someone to show up to a meeting and draw maps about where they ride and what it's like.
Maybe working through the Cascade Bike Club.
Yeah, there's so many different ways to network,
Or biking in the area and what they would like.
A lot of activists.
You know, that's Stephen's cue.
I'm sorry?
The Cascade Bicycle Club request here from Tom.
Yes,
Yes,
so
we've got
we're,
somebody.
it's pending confirmation, but I'm hopefully having a Cascade rep come out to talk to the TAB, similar to how we had Richard come out and talk from the perspective of public health on the development of master plan and major considerations as you develop the master plan. In response to Cynthia's comment on the walk and roll plan or going a little more in depth, that's exactly what they did with the walk and roll plan. It was just done in 2015, so it's already 4 years old. So there's going to be gaps in the data from the walk and roll to what we see today. And that's something that we can definitely try to take on an effort like that. We'll have to figure out how to squeeze that into the schedule.
The Cascade Bike Club does, they just did the traffic counts, I think, in May?
They do
Yeah,
annual
May,
counts
so-
around the region, but their data is fairly limited for Issaquah. I already looked at what they have.
Okay. I was thinking you could use them for outreach that they have and they could put something out saying City of Issaquah is having open house or something. If you bike in the area, he's planning to attend that way. We could use them to broadcast information to get people out.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just thinking about continuing on, because we have some more things to talk about. Can we just say, and not that, don't say, you can still contribute to this conversation, but how could we feel comfortable that we're going to come back to this, and when would we come back to this, for those of us who want to think about it a little bit more and get back to the walk and roll plan and analyze this map? What would be the next step for us to come back to this conversation?
So are you wanting to form a subcommittee since
I
you
don't
asked
know.
that question?
What do you guys
or-
want to do? You want to ask Stephen to help us with that and see if we could set aside some time to work together on this topic?
I'd say yes, because this is kind of a big,
Agree.
I think so. I mean, if we're going to really increase multimodal activity in the city, bikes, like mobility connectivity is
I think all of these topics, we're feeling like we'd like more time with it, but this one is definitely striking a chord that will need some help from you to maybe put together a committee.
Okay, and was the topic specifically on bicycling or on all the modal networks?
The thing about bicycling that is, I mean, you probably be able to speak to this more definitively, but it's anytime you're trying to I used to think about marketing to specific groups, when you can identify them and you communicate with them, then they make it easier to market to them. And I feel like cyclists identify a cyclist, they receive, there's just, I guess I think it's an easy way to get public more input from the community. Just they're easy to find, they're really active, they really care a lot, and so I guess what we're talking about two different things. One is a subcommittee of this group. Is it a subcommittee, or could it be a committee with off-board members as well, like an ad hoc committee that had board chaired by the board and then other, I mean, I don't know, I guess I'm not entirely so sure what we're solving for, so I'm just sort of throwing out ideas. But I think the answer to the question is, yeah, the subcommittee seems to be interested in bicycling. Bicycling, we want to represent those who haven't started bicycling yet. For those people who do bicycle, they know a lot as well, and they are easy to find and talk to and get their opinion.
Okay, so yeah, we'll follow up with you
Okay.
on forming a subcommittee for that.
Sounds very
And then
good.
we'll talk about how to incorporate more community members in that conversation.
In other ways, at the very high level, for me, those 4 bullets, as far as things that we would want to connect a network to, those 4 bullets make 100% sense to me. That would be some criteria that we would screen projects through.
Thank you. Any other destinations that should be connected besides what's listed here? I know major destinations is kind of a catch-all, but it
Go ahead,
includes.
Cynthia.
This isn't really, this is good for making your long list, but then when it comes to prioritizing, I'd rather us be successful in areas that we're going to, really prioritize the areas we're more likely to be successful. And I just
Right.
worry about areas, I want to make sure we're prioritizing. I don't know if that's part of the plan, is prioritizing.
Yes. Stephen, I know that you've had input from many, if not all, of the TAB members on the initial project prioritization criteria, and those do take into account land use.
Yes, so the Yeah, the prioritization that we had talked about, the project selection criteria that we had talked about does take into account land use. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Does that
Yes,
answer your
I think
question?
so.
Okay.
And then a question for me is, regional trails, are those in that list?
No, but they will be now. So
Good.
we'll put them in there.
Thank you.
If we could just funnel people onto the regional trails, it would be
Yeah.
a lot easier.
Yeah,
Right.
if I could just get to one, I'd take it.
We do have some data for East Lake Sammamish Trail, like actual data, trip counters on the region.
I
East
think
Lake
the
Sammamish
permanent
Trail.
counter is further up north, though.
It is slightly further up north, yeah.
Oh.
But it kind of gets you some sense of
Yeah.
use.
So knowing that we're going to continue to work on this, I think we'll move along to our next topic.
Okay.
Okay,
So the topic.
Oh, yeah, the transit, yes.
yeah, next topic.
So the next topic is transit. And one thing I want to add a little context here is that when we talk about transit, it's often working in tandem with auto improvements because they're using the same streets. Since currently the transit that's provided in Issaquah is bus transit. This isn't quite touching on the light rail extension that is going to be coming and that this plan does include because that's kind of a separate process and we know that's happening. It's budgeted for. But this is looking at how Issaquah can be a better host to transit and what you can do as a city to make sure that the buses that people in Issaquah are using are reliable and move at a reasonable speed. And so the criteria we look at, and this is a little bit wonky, but we looked at how does King County Metro evaluate its transit lines? Where are the streets where transit lines are actually falling below those standards of service? So when buses get late, they get unreliable, and that means that people miss appointments, they're late to work, they lose a job, or they're late to school. None of that is okay. So we want to ensure that streets are good hosts to transit. And so looking at this, we looked at where those transit lines are, and there's a number of transit lines here, but where are those transit lines, and on what streets are they traveling, where transit is falling below King County Metro's standards. And so when we look at these streets, we're thinking about them as locations for potential improvements. And what does that mean when we say improvements for transit? So that means specific improvements like transit signal priority at some of these signals so that transit vehicles can go through the signal and extend the green phase and not get stuck behind a red light. In some cases, capacity improvements. Some of those are already identified in your concurrency planning, which is your long-range planning to add capacity for growth. In other cases, there may be things like a queue jump lane where a bus can pull ahead of a queue of traffic, or a right turn lane that also prioritizes transit. So there's a number of different strategies that you can employ to make streets more attractive for transit. And I also wanted to add that your strategic plan is identifying a transit plan as a next step within the next 5 years for the city to go into depth on. So this will be looked at in greater depth there, but we wanted to make sure to identify locations where transit could be improved at this point. And so we wanted to ask you, is this the right location? Should we be looking at where buses are running late, or are there other things that we should be keeping in mind as we start to look for potential transit improvements?
Yeah, so I had a question. Is there a reason why school buses, for example, like Issaquah High School buses weren't included on this? Because it's talking about the lateness for just King County Metro.
Right.
But I know, for example, like there's bus lines for IHS that consistently run late. So I was wondering why that would not be included.
School buses are typically ran by the school districts, which is usually not part of the city planning process, but that is actually an important point, that the school buses are being impacted by the same congestion.
Yeah, and Kobe brings up an interesting point. If you made a right turn lane that prioritized only buses, would that include school buses? Could it?
That's a good question. I believe that it could, but I'm not familiar of any place where it does.
Wow.
That said,
Just wait.
I'm not an expert on bus and school bus integration, so that's something we can definitely look into.
It's a really interesting point.
No, that's a really good point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I say something about that?
Yep, please.
I think there's a strategic thing. I mean, these are the next generation's commuters, right? The next generation's workforce. And if we're making it, I mean, my kids went to high school, they hated taking the bus, but if the bus is faster than the alternatives, I mean, I think it's an investment that we consider, even if it's not necessarily in our jurisdiction. There's still things we could do to encourage that if we decide that's important. And then the other thing I was just going to add is, I think, kind of thinking strategically, anytime you can make a bus more competitive than a car,
Right.
Everybody wins.
everybody wins. And so I think that even though we don't control, I mean, it's a really interesting, I hadn't thought about the fact, even though we don't control King County Metro, we can make it more transit friendly, make it easier. And I think anything we can do to make, if you're sitting in your car and a bus goes by because they get to go and you don't, I mean, we're trying to compete to some extent, so.
Right.
One thing I'd like to add is that typically when city planning process considers improvements to access to schools, they actually move in the form of actually redefining the bus routes to connect directly to the schools so that you have more bus routes going to the schools, so the schools rely less on their own bus system versus building the improvements directly for bus
I see.
service or the school buses. So that's just one thing to consider.
I guess I think it's a strategic objective to make that a positive experience by whatever mode. And recognize that that's an investment in the next generation of workforce.
Especially because buses are on the roads the exact same time we're all on the roads trying to get to work, so.
The other, interesting, talking about that fundamental change is instead of having school buses, since they're just used in the morning, used in the afternoon, use King County Metro buses for school buses, so you're not maintaining two completely separate sets of buses.
Yeah.
And they would have the priority built into it, the technology built into it already. They could be used as school buses for the 2 morning runs, and then go back to the other bus routes.
And King County does offer a school pool program and actually has active projects in Issaquah working with the school district to get more connections, alternative connections to the schools, but not to the full extent of running a whole nother bus route ran by Metro to get students to the schools.
I'm not sure if like in Seattle, that they have a bus card that the students can use the Metro buses for getting to school. Is that?
I believe last year, the year before, City of Seattle has put it in their budget to actually start giving high school students Orca passes.
So am I hearing some interest in having an additional criteria under number 3, transit, besides improving reliability on corridors where the lateness threshold is high? It's something that prioritizes school transportation, school mass transportation.
Right.
Some kind of language about that.
At least start identifying it.
Yeah, whether it is seeking opportunities to expand King County Metro service to serve the schools better, or to include schools in prioritization, access, whatever it is, but to call out schools in that. Number 3, seeing that, hearing that, nodding something, maybe you guys could figure out how to phrase something like that?
Yeah, we'll
Yes.
put our heads together and
think those are great
put a
ideas.
proposal forward.
I have one more thing about the map. Go ahead, Cynthia.
I was just going to say, I don't know if others agree, but I also just think this idea that I was talking about, just making it more competitive, that just specifically trying to make it more competitive. So the streets, we're adding to this list, make investments to improve reliability. And maybe that's the same thing as just making a better experience, but for whether it's school or not school, to think about the experience and having to compete. And maybe that's all captured in the language you already have in 3A, but we talked about.
Maybe we define bus. It can be any.
I'm not talking about the school thing. I'm talking about the idea of making buses have a priority on the streets.
You're talking more
Improve.
the user experience more so than just speed reliability. Is that what you're saying?
I guess I'm wondering, is reliability, see, to me, if it takes 50 minutes, but it always takes 50 minutes, that's reliable. If I can get it to take 42 minutes, then it's competing with a car. So those, I see those as two separate things.
efficiency more than reliability, maybe? Reliability and?
Trying to make it more,
I think reliability is a big thing. For example, when I take the bus to Bellevue, it's always on time because I'm only the second stop from the Issaquah Trans Center. But coming home, it comes from Northgate, and it's never on time. So it's to the point where it's just unreliable. I don't know if it's going to be 5 minutes late or 30 minutes late.
So
That would be the reliability.
I'm not saying reliability is not important. I'm saying there's a different goal besides reliability, and that's to actually make it faster so people are going to maybe be more motivated to do it.
Are you saying to increase the standard, perhaps? Not that the lateness standard is perhaps not enough. It's not good enough to be reliable. It has to be faster. Is that what you're saying?
I agree with that.
I think that's what I'm trying to say. I mean, we're trying to think big here about what we want this plan to include, and I think if we can if there's anything that's in the power of the city of Issaquah to make transit faster and more competitive with with driving alone, and you just mentioned at the beginning of this, there are things you can do that I hadn't thought of to make them give buses a priority as you're moving through the city. I would be supportive of that, and I'm wondering if there's nods, then I guess we would be asking you to add that. Unless you're telling me it's already captured in A, but A is about reliability.
it is more about speed and reliability, more so than convenience, which is how Metro kind of defines that time factor of.
Say that again?
Convenience. So.
First part, you said reliability to you means what?
Oh, the speed and reliability is what's captured in the language now.
Oh, so speed is captured with the distance.
Speed is, but it's Metro looks at it different from convenience. So is it shorter than the auto trip?
Yeah.
Or
That's
even not
more
as
of a
big
convenience factor.
difference.
The speed is it able to maintain its own speed, not necessarily making the trip faster than the auto.
Okay. I like where you're going.
Is there anything? Is it actionable to try to make it more competitive with driving alone? Is that a policy that we should consider, or is that just?
It is a policy we can consider. It is.
Yeah.
I'm nodding.
Okay.
Everybody's nodding.
It's just the question
Look
of
into that.
feasibility as we look through the project list later on that will be under further consideration.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I have one more question. I have two questions, sorry. In biking, we identified these criteria of priorities of major destination transit hubs, blah, blah, blah. When it comes to transit, it's only transit hubs. So for instance, serving major employment locations centers is not considered a priority for transit. That seems like a missing opportunity there, especially when we have such a huge employer and growing even more in what would be a desert on the north side of I-90 right there with no increase in transit service. So should we include making investments in order to serve transit that gets you to employment centers as well as transit hubs?
Yeah, and schools.
And schools. That would be part of the schools one. Good idea. Okay.
You mentioned this.
Yeah, add employment centers to schools in some way as another destination priority for transit.
Costco,
good?
Home Depot,
Yeah.
I'll take the bus.
Geez, Home Depot, Costco, all that. And we have no transit service to Lake Sammamish State Park or improvements to that. Maybe it's adequate already. Okay. And then my last question had to do with the way the map was written. It says future light rail station area. I don't know if I've ever seen it this way before. Is it really already defined, and should we include it before it is defined?
That's a good question. We wanted to include it just for your reference because that's where it's been discussed as being located, but we can remove it if that's going to raise
That's
more
currently where
questions.
Sound Transit has their dot.
Yeah.
That's where they have their dot.
That's where they,
That's the
Yeah,
center
but we
of
haven't
their
put
dot.
our dot anywhere yet, I don't think.
so
Yeah.
we could also note that that's as defined by Sound Transit.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's important to keep it there, though.
You could, what I was going to suggest as an
could move it.
alternative is that the Regional
just a
Growth
bigger box.
Center
Okay.
is the qualifying feature, right? So couldn't we use the Regional Growth Center boundaries to say that that's the destination or the location?
Oh, so the
That's
idea
what I'm
is the
suggesting.
future light rail station is somewhere inside.
In the regional
of
growth center,
regional-
because that's what's qualifying for the light rail.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
Would that be fair? Because this just is too limiting right here to the creative thoughts I've heard floating around.
ultimately, the conversation on what the transit plan, what our full citywide network is going to look like, is going to be parallel to a conversation of where should light rail go. So they'll complement each other when we go through that process. So I think it's fair to kind of go to do that change.
Excellent, thank you. And that was all I had. Anybody else have any other thoughts before we move on to the next topic?
No.
Okay, good. You guys are doing great. We are.
Say one, I mean,
Yes, sir.
the routes here, these are all regional, going to someplace else. They don't show the routes that are within Issaquah, because there is a bus route that goes West Lake Sammamish Road and works its way up the back way to the Issaquah
Yeah.
Highlands. But
Right,
there's-
I did remember.
Right.
Yeah.
So we'll revise this map to show all of the routes, not just the ones that are currently run late,
Late,
according
yeah,
to the standard.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, okay, great. Thanks, you guys, that was very productive. The last section, and we are a little behind schedule, but do you think that we can finish this in 5 or 10 minutes? And
Yes.
is that, you can do that, and is everybody okay hanging out for another 10, finishing the next section, which is autos? Okay, Sarah, it's yours again.
All right, thank you. So we looked for autos at 3 focus areas: connectivity, improved traffic flow, and safety. I just want to point out connectivity and improved traffic flow are things that the city has already taken pretty in-depth looks at. And so we're going to kind of breeze through those and show you maps from existing and adopted plans, and then we'll focus in on safety. And so this builds, of course, on the level of service standard adopted in the Issaquah Comprehensive Plan, the concurrency planning that you've been doing, the planning for the Central Issaquah Regional Growth Center, and then the guiding principles for the Mobility Master Plan, which mentions safety specifically. First, looking at connectivity. Its goal is to build a connected street grid that prioritizes the movement of people and goods, including building out the proposed street grid in the Central Issaquah Plan in tandem with new development. So as that new development comes in, it pays its fair share of building out the street grid. And that's what you see here in purple dashed lines. That's the street grid in the Central Issaquah Plan. And then supporting new I-90 crossings where feasible. So again, our question here is, are these the right priorities that we should think about when it comes to connectivity? Are there other priorities that we should think about?
Any comments?
Me.
Can you help me? I'm trying to see a good definition of in tandem. Is that strong enough language for really what people are trying to get done so that the infrastructure is built with the development? Is in tandem concurrent? I mean, not concurrency, not the 6-year thing, but the,
Right.
what are the alternatives to in tandem?
Like synonyms?
Pardon me?
I mean, is that what you?
Or would you,
Okay.
could you say must precede the completion of new development? Would that be another, I don't know. You know, people are looking for some real security here, and that infrastructure will be done when the new development is being used.
But if it's required as part of their like, if they don't get occupancy until they built the street that they promised to build, then that's the assurance, but I don't know if that's how we work
so
in the city.
is it? That's why you're here, Sheldon. What do you want to say about that? I don't know, I think this is above my pay grade, but I just feel that
I feel like
it bears,
in tandem isn't like,
doesn't sound like it really is.
And that percentage, I'm feeling just a little bit too cliche as far as movement of people and goods. If we're building the street network, it's for us, city, around, not necessarily we're going to have goods and delivery trucks finding the back streets and things.
Right.
They're going to be put on the main roads.
Right. So then, would
The
you?
network is for connectivity within the city.
Okay. So then, would you take out the language prioritizes the movement of people and goods and just say connected street? No, connected street grid. Period.
I would say, well, build a connected street grid that allows, about that.
To your point, yeah, okay. And then another language strength, crossings where feasible. Well, it's never feasible because nobody wants to pay for it. You know, it's when is it feasible? I mean, how would we ever get these things if we just said whenever it was feasible?
A word needed or?
Yeah, I don't know, something stronger.
Okay.
Sheldon?
You could have
Mike.
So feasibility, you could have some conditions that would render a project alignment in a condition such that you could not permit it. While you may be able to find the millions to build it, you may never get permits for it. So feasibility is probably more subject to financing as well as can you get it permitted.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe the feasible, so feasible, maybe practical.
I don't know. I don't think I have an answer for these questions. I'm just bringing them up.
Okay.
Darn permits.
Yeah.
Dark permits, yeah, darkness words. So I have a couple things, and I think maybe it gets at Sheldon's point, like build a connected street grid, like we're gonna go build a street grid, like what do you mean? Except for under I-90 crossings or greenfield development, I'm not understanding how this is really gonna happen. Like, we're actually talking about putting new, I think that this grid system is way better than the old, curvilinear, dead-end, side, cul-de-sac type of thing. So if we're saying we want to promote more of a grid where there is greenfield development, do we have a lot of greenfield development? I guess I'm just wondering what we really mean about where we're going to build a connected street grid.
I think that's where those purple things.
Right, so just to add some context.
No, they didn't give, that's just up
Right.
there.
So this is what has been adopted in the city's Central Issaquah plan for the Central Issaquah, so
Okay.
I'll repeat that again. And so what you see here is the connected street grid in Central Issaquah, which is not greenfield development, but
Is
will
it
be
built?
redeveloped. It is not yet built.
So those are, that's just showing roads that are concepts that don't exist, that we're talking about building out.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And are these the roads that are proposed based on where we think development is? Like, so,
Yes.
hey, developer X wants to build 20 new houses here, so as part of their impact fees there, or whatever, they're going to be required to build this stretch of road. Is that what that means?
What this is in the adopted plan by the city council, and the purple lines, they are all new roads. And the intent in the plan was to demonstrate or to show where improvements to the grid could be made to support the growth within the Central Issaquah.
Catching up now, sorry.
When
I was really
when a
confused.
property redevelops, you're correct, there's no green fields, there's only brown fields left. The property, however much overlaps with that new street alignment, would be responsible for dedicating and possibly building that road. It depends upon the density that they're going to be building, but there's a number of things in there. But the idea is that at that time, when the development occurs, the road would get built.
Okay, perfect.
So I wanted to finish the comment. I was going to say, first of all, thank you. I was just really looking down at the page, and I just was thinking generally, and I wasn't paying attention to your slide. So now it makes a lot of sense, and I'm all for it, because I think that is a wise, so sorry, there's just a lot of catching up. But I don't know if you're going to have an equally compelling specific slide for B, but that sounds like, hey, if you want to get rich, get $1 million. Like, find solutions that improve vehicle flow. I mean, it just seems so broad. I'm not sure if that's not a policy to me, that's a wish. I guess we all want vehicle flow to be, and we want to preserve jobs. I mean, that's why we're doing all this, right? It just seems, so I don't know I don't know what to do with that. That just feels like a huge goal, yeah. So I just didn't know what to do with that one.
Okay. would it help for me to advance to the next slide so we can put that in context?
Maybe you've
Yes.
got the answer?
Well, maybe the city already has an answer. So what you see here, and this is not a great representation on the big screen, but this is where the city has identified projects for its 20-year concurrency plan. So what that plan does is it identifies the projects that are needed, and this is in your comprehensive plan, the projects that are needed to maintain an adequate level of service defined as minimizing delay at intersections for autos passing through those intersections. These are the projects that are needed to maintain the city's current adopted standard. So these projects have already been defined by the city. They're broadly in order to improve vehicle flow on arterial streets that experience congestion so that people can get to jobs and businesses.
So then it should be fund or implement the solutions, because it sounded like
yes,
that work hadn't been done yet. And now it sounds like there's a lot of great work that's been done.
Okay.
That feels more like, I have the same experience of the previous slide. It's like the words seem too big, but now I see this graphic, so I kind of get more what you're saying, and it seems more specific.
Okay.
That it doesn't say what the solution is.
The solution's the visual on the right.
No, those are the locations. Those aren't the solutions, are they? They're
No,
just places that need improvement.
And the specific improvements have been identified.
Oh, they identify, okay.
Yeah, so they're...
So they're like left turn lanes or roundabouts or some.
Specific.
Yeah, okay, okay, I'm sorry, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And-
Yeah, right.
And we can send you the latest CIP that was adopted by council that tells you exactly what the improvements are for each of these.
Then it wouldn't be find solutions, would it? Wouldn't it just be implement solutions?
Right.
We've already found the solutions.
That's kind of what I was confused when I was studying the memo, and then I look up and there's this graphic, and so now I'm just trying to reconcile the words that are in front of this page and so. Yeah, A and B, I had the same reaction too. They like this broad thing, and then without that, it's actually much more defined, and you're a lot further along.
Yeah, when it comes to traffic flow and efficiency at intersections, that we are the most ahead on that than anything else, because that's all the city is really focused on when it came to concurrency, level of service, and major project improvements. The walk and roll plan was the first plan that developed more major non-motorized projects, which is why we have that list of projects, but it's still, as you saw, not as extensive as we'd like it to be. So there's a lot more work that needs to go into a lot of it still. But this is where a lot more years of work has gone into this.
Yeah, maybe if we just change the language to say
Tighten up the
implement
language on A and B, and
Right.
just so,
Because find feels like you don't know what you're supposed to do.
it sounds like there's a body of work that
Yeah,
has to
but
happen.
it sounds like we already have like, over here, put in a roundabout, over here, put in a improved sight distance, whatever.
Sound good?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can we go to C?
Right.
Ready?
So as you've just discussed, there are quite a number of, there's quite a lot of work that's already gone into looking at making new street connections and improving traffic flow. One area where projects haven't been fully identified is where safety improvements might be needed. And so we looked at that at the crosswalk section where we identified collisions that involve pedestrians and bicyclists. But here on the map, in green and orange and red, that heat map is showing the density of all collisions, of all crashes that occur. And then in the orange dots, you see severe injury collision, so a severe injury resulted from that collision. The black dots with the white X's were fatalities that resulted from an auto collision. So these are the locations where we're seeing the most severe collisions, where someone is seriously injured or someone dies. And so we wanted to ask, are those the locations where we should be focusing additional improvements? So should we go back to those and say, okay, are any safety improvements already planned here? If not, what safety improvements could be planned here? Or instead, should we look at the locations where there's a greater density of collisions rather than the most fatal or severe collisions?
It seemed to me this would be one of the preliminary things to look at before we actually identify on the other slide what all the improvements are going to be.
Right.
Any other thoughts? One thing that comes to my mind here is a cry for, why does somebody have to get hurt or killed before I can fix the safety of an intersection? I wish there was, and it seems like a lot of smart people in the room, how come we can't identify an unsafe intersection before somebody gets hurt or killed?
Well, yeah, Stephen.
We don't have the technology to do it yet. That is still research. Bellevue is actually experimenting right now where the camera system is evaluating specific infrastructure in situations where there's conflicts between pedestrians, bikes, and cars. And the model that they're using is actually gauging the level of risk to the users. And that is actually proactively identifying high-risk locations based off near misses, complaint system, and then just known infrastructure risks that has just been researched at the federal level and the state level, and in some cases the local level. That is probably the closest system out there to do it, and it's still under research.
Well, we already have a complaint system here of varying degrees of sophistication or quantifying. And is there a way that we could add, to leave it just with this it just feels so unsatisfying to me. It would be, since we are forward thinking, how could we incorporate something like that, whether it's a complaint system and going deep into the spectrum here. Cynthia brought something up a few weeks ago, and correct me if I'm wrong, that even the sense of not being safe inhibits people from using other modes of transportation. And so to disregard the ability to identify by my senses that something is not safe. I mean, I can tell. I don't have to go out and get killed to tell you that that's not safe. So how can we bring in some other system to identify these things before?
Maybe better utilize complaint data.
Yeah,
More robust complaint system.
Report a concern. I don't know.
Integrating
So a lot of what the city does now is actually incorporates a lot of complaint-based data into this safety analysis for projects now. It's not reflected here, but that is something that is already done.
It's not on here.
Yeah. The one thing to keep in mind is when you look at it in an equity lens, a very small percentage of the population actually uses the complaint-based system. So there's a disproportionate amount of complaints based on either certain areas or certain issues in specific neighborhoods. So that's one thing to kind of consider when you look at complaint-based system, which is why there is more research to figure out more proactive ways to look at safety improvements.
Okay, so I guess I'm going to push just a little bit and say, don't just say no. See if we can find a way for us to get something in here that's before a severe injury or fatality, so that we can identify unsafe intersections. I know there's got to be a way. I'm sure it's not ready yet, but there's something. We use surveys for all sorts of things. If you want to be more, have more robust outreach to get more opinions about the complaint things. I don't know what it is. I just know that there has to be a means for people to communicate about this, and that we can't wait until Bellevue does all their science or something. We just got to do it.
Yeah, we'll take a look at the options and see what we can bring forward.
That'd be great. Thank you. Anything else? Okay, is that all we have about autos?
That's all.
Steps, here we
Yeah,
go.
Just moving on to next steps. So through July, the rest of July and August, we'll be taking your feedback from tonight and using it to develop policies, programs and policies. In August and September, we'll be prioritizing those with the revised project selection criteria that are being revised right now based on your feedback. And then September and October, we'll be completing a financial analysis to understand the total bucket of funds that is available, and then how the costs of these projects compare to those funds. So of the project list, how far down can you get with the funding that's available. And then from September to February, there will be a draft plan review, first by staff and then by the Transportation Advisory Board, and then by the City Council as well as the community for approval in February.
So from now till
Ambitious.
October, we'll be soliciting more of these questions to get feedback as we go through this, develop every step of the way.
So if we do that, I'd like to, my comment would be to make sure we have this a week ahead of time and exactly what we're going to be looking at so we can come.
More prepared.
Yeah, we'll work better on doing that.
And then, so I guess the question is, so in August, so our next meeting is end of August. And so at that meeting, are we going to get the list, or the week before that meeting, are we going to get the list of projects to be prioritizing? Or are we going to get the refined list of policies based on today's feedback? Because I think we were talking about maybe trying to get more in depth on the data associated with bike stuff. So does that happen before the August meeting, or?
So the plan for August was to get that preliminary list not prioritized yet, not quite vetted. It's going from this modal network and identifying all the major gaps.
Okay.
With the subcommittee and consideration of looking more closely at the bicycling data, that can just get added in as we go through the process. It doesn't need to be done by our August meeting. So because we have until October to kind of collect all this.
Okay.
Okay.
Anything else about the schedule? No? I do want to take a moment to ask for public comment, but I also want to say that I'm so sorry we're behind schedule. I agree with the other board members that I think we would have handled this more quickly had we had this information in advance on Friday with our packets so that we could have studied ahead and we would have come with our questions, been ready to go. So next time we'll have these in advance, and then that way the public can have it too. So would I like to ask for public comment on this last very large section? Is there any public comment?
So it's impossible to comment on this breadth of information effectively. I'm going to go back and say River and Streams Board actually needs to be included in your list, because one of the big conflicts in this town is our roads tend to cut down our trees. And right now we have that example of West Newport Way and a sidewalk that would cut down trees on the new Bergsma property that the city just is purchasing or purchased. And so we need to have some criteria to understand when we need sidewalks on both sides, or is it possible to have, say, an option like a forested trail on one side and a multimodal on the other side, and that instead would fulfill the need as compared to saying we need a sidewalk on both sides. What we actually have is we have a need for people to be able to move down both sides of the road or to move effectively in a corridor, right? Because that's really the problem. The problem isn't the sidewalk itself. So when you talk about a sidewalk, many of our sidewalks exist, but they're horrifying. And I don't want to walk on them because it's, say, Gilman. It's gritty, it's nasty, it's loud, you're by the freeway, and you really, people are never going to use that even as a commuter corridor because it is so bad. So is it not better to have a safe, connected corridor for walking, not necessarily on streets, that people will actually be able to use effectively? This is the conversation that I would like to have. Not we're making a street and we're going to go bang, bang, we're going to have our things on either side, and why aren't people using it? Well, they aren't using it because it's hellish to use, right? So you need quality. So pedestrian convenience is core. Somebody talked about the grade changes, which is huge in our town. So when you talk about getting people out of their vehicles, for example, we need to plan places at the bottoms of hills for people to be able to pick them up. They can walk or ride on the valley floor. They could even park bikes in a locker. But getting their bikes up a hill for a normal person is not going to happen. Most people don't walk up Squawk Mountain with their groceries. So the question is, how do you keep your auto transportation off of your congested corridors? So I didn't understand why we're only looking at enhanced crosswalks every 600 feet when our central Issaquah plan mandates intersections every 250 to 300 feet. I think looking at every 600 feet without that grid that you saw on her slide, what do those crosswalks, how do those overlay onto that grid system? And then you would have a conversation. Sorry, I'm talking so fast, it's a lot. Do you have a stress test for pedestrians? You have a stress test for bikes, but I get stressed out as a pedestrian because the sidewalks begin, it's ugly, you can't cross, you're there for a flippin' half an hour on 900 trying to get across the road, and it's all stressful. With the left-hand turns, Front Street, I just want to beat the living bejesus out of the signals because I can never get across the street. I find that stressful. Sheldon, you're squinting at me again. Okay, wayfinding. Most people who come to this town, because we have tourists, we have people who are not from here, and the wayfinding is non-existent in this town. Unless they can somehow find a map over at a hotel, it's like, oh, I'm here, they're using their phone, but your phone doesn't really tell you if you're seeing something good. So how do we create a system where you can find the pleasant trails, you can find the places to look at and be for everyone? And I didn't see wayfinding anywhere in this transportation effort. Transit. You only have this very, I consider strange, well, the buses are late. Well, I drive by and people are in the rain without a shelter trying to wait for a bus. People are in the powering sunshine trying to wait for a bus. You wait for a bus, there's not even a thing saying when the heck a bus might be coming or if it comes, if it's every half hour. And so it's an ungainly system. So we are looking at trying to make an easy-to-use, consistent, functional transit system. It is our job to create the physical construct and then lobby Metro and Sound Transit to get the service that we need and potentially fund extra service for transit as compared to creating auto capacity. So now parking capacity at transit park and rides is one of the single factors for people not taking the bus because the parking is full at 7 o'clock in the morning. And in nowhere here do I see any capacity projects for transit parking. Then one last bit on your traffic modeling saying that those projects are going to solve traffic is so erroneous it makes me just want to go, "Bleh." Half of our most congested intersections are exempt from concurrency. We do not have projects that address their congestion because it would be too expensive, and so council has exempted them. And so when you say we're trying to improve traffic, we are not even looking at our most congested intersections by policy. Okay, so that is what I can fit in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie.
Thanks, Connie.
Very much. Okay, again, sorry we're late. I think we have one more topic, and that is our meeting schedule, which may be, let's say, under staff report, and then we can adjourn. So if you can hang on just for one more minute.
We are waiting on confirmation from the city clerk's office on, the city council is changing their work session meetings. So they're going to be meeting every Monday, or they're meeting the first, second, and third Mondays of each month, and they're trying to decide on that fourth week on whether they're going to meet the Monday or Tuesday. We're waiting on that final confirmation on and if that impacts us. So
our August meeting is?
Our August meeting is still on, and council chambers at same time, same place.
And I'm going to look that date up so I can say it to everybody.
Is that date? Yeah.
Is that the 26th, August 26th?
Monday, August 26th?
Is that right, Stephen?
Yes, August 26th.
August 26th, 6 p.m. here in council chambers. September, our meeting date might change between a Monday or Tuesday late in the month, and we will know as soon as possible.
Yes.
Not waiting till the August meeting to make that announcement.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. With that, so are there any other reports? Any student report? No. Any other staff report? Can I adjourn this meeting? Great. We're going to adjourn this meeting at 8:27. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was good material.
Lots of material, but.